What's going on, guys? My name is Richard. Welcome back to another Stock Market Outlook video sponsored by MarketSmith. Definitely there's a ton to cover in this video, so make sure you stick around until the end. We'll talk about the market indexes, leading stocks, my previous watch list and how I performed this past week. Then we'll move on to sentiment from a few different sources, the IBD Big Picture article, and finally the GMI Signal from richardlmoglen.com. So definitely stick around. We'll cover a ton. And before we get into the video, I want to give a brief little spiel about how to deal with a week like this when there's so much volatility and we have a gap and go to the downside like we saw on the 28th. So first of all, going into the week, you have to be ready for anything. On the weekend, that's where you really put in the time, analyze the market like we're doing in this video, and come up with a plan for each of your positions, know exactly your line in the sand, have your stop losses in place. Now, if you're an investor, you're going to treat what happened last week with a completely different basically outlook, and you're actually looking to add positions instead of managing risk and getting stopped out likely on this Tuesday. And basically, regardless of your time frame, you have to visualize any possibility for all your positions. And if we do have a day like this on the 28th, where we had a gap down and then a move down 2.83% on the NASDAQ composite, many growth stocks moved multiples of that. So basically 7, 8, 9%. You have to be ready. And there's a saying from Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And really on a day like this, you have to have a plan. And as a trader on a day like this, your first thought should be capital preservation and managing risk above all else. We're not here to catch bottoms. We're not trying to sit through basis as traders. And we know that we can make up performance very quickly because we take very concentrated positions. So when the trend gets back on our side, the indexes get back above the 21 and 50 SMA, that's when we make the majority of our gains. But investors, obviously, they're going to treat a week like this very differently, maybe even adding to positions, their highest conviction holdings. But traders, which is kind of what I am, that's why I'm speaking directly to you. You really want to focus on just keeping that equity curve as close to all-time highs as possible. So when the trend resumes, the uptrend resumes, that's when we can make everything back and keep pushing that equity curve higher and higher. So I just want to say a little bit about that. Always have a plan, visualize anything that can happen. So when you see in the pre-market that we're gapping down 1-2%, you're not getting too frustrated, you're not getting mad, you're staying objective, staying calm, and just focusing on managing risk. So hope that helps. And I made an entire video about how to handle pullbacks that goes into a lot more detail about routines and processes. So that's linked below in the description and should be popping up right now. And just personally, in terms of what I did, I had some positions going into this day. Stuff was acting well, and I basically got stopped out very close to the open, just focusing on managing risk above all else. And I knew that basically when the trend resumes and the selling subsides, I can make it up very quickly because I'm waiting for those very precise entry points where I can manage risk and basically buying through proper buy points. So that's a bit about how I handle things. Obviously, I did lose money on this day, but I kept the equity curve pretty much close to all-time highs. And most importantly, I protected my mental capital as well. So it's not only about financial capital, you also want to keep your mind right. And by basically cutting my losses quickly before they turn into large losses, I can keep my head on straight and be ready for the next uptrend. So with that, let's get into some analysis of the NASDAQ. So on this Monday, the 27th, we had a nice upside reversal off the 50 SMA, a good closing range. The expectation is higher here, but then the next day, this is where the expectation breaker came in. We had a gap down and fall through, close basically at the lows on very, very high volume. So this is distribution day here very clearly, and we had fall through, basically gap ups and then poor closes the next 2 days. And then we found support right near this prior low. Big upside reversal here. It didn't look great at the beginning of the day. We had a little bit of a gap up open even, and we kind of stayed strong for a little bit, but then we had a quick flush and then a strong recovery into the end of the trading day. So a pretty good performance here, although on much lighter volume. So we'll have to see whether this falls through and manages to break above these highs here. And I would like to see some conviction, some good volume come in as well, because you do see a lot of distribution days, a big cluster of distribution days very close to each other. But you got to be open to any possibility, whether we rally from here or we just continue on to the downside. Because going over to a weekly chart, this does not look good. A heavy down week here, not much of a push off the lows, and going to a monthly, You can see that for the entire month of September, we're basically finishing right at the lows, and we do have a little bit of rally, obviously, in October because of today. But basically, on the higher time frames, things are showing a lot of distribution, and we have to be ready no matter what. And if you tried to buy some stuff today and it started to work, make sure to keep those stops pretty tight, because we could easily keep falling to the 200-day if we do lose this low right here. So I'll be watching this level as well. 360 on the QQQ is important, and we'll basically have to see what happens. We don't have to predict what happens. All we have to do is analyze what's currently going on in the market and react according to basically our sell rules. So that's a run through of the NASDAQ. The S&P 500 looks pretty similar, and you can see, let me close this right here, that we were holding the 50 SMA, holding, and then we had this expectation breaker, once again finishing right at the lows, and poor days the next 2 days, and then a big upside reversal here, and maybe the start of a new rally, but we're still below a declining 21 EMA, and looks like the 50 SMA is flatlining, maybe even declining at this point. So this looks like the left side of a potential base. And regardless of what the indexes are doing, the NASDAQ Composite, the S&P 500, really as a trader, you care most what the leading stocks are doing, and that's what we'll get into later on in this video. And basically, we have to wait for setups to emerge from high potential bases where you can manage your risk very tightly. So this looks like the left side of the base. We'll have to see if this kind of forms out a rounded correction. Most likely there'll be some emotional price action continuing on, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens next week and in the coming weeks as well. But that's the S&P 500. Also good progress on this Friday on declining volume, but we'll have to see whether this rally sticks. So that is the S&P 500. Moving on, let's go to the IWO, the Russell 2000 growth. Big upside reversal, also poor performance these 3 days, but very good volume as well coming into this index. So that's a good sign. Small caps are acting well, and we'll have to see whether this 300 level is resistance once again, and if it can basically push through all these moving averages and start to finally make its way above these pivots. So that is the IWO. Looking at small caps in general, IWM, the Russell 2000, big upside reversal actually taking over the prior day's high, it looks like, and looks like decent volume, although not higher than the prior day's session. So once again, I would like to see more conviction in the volume, but the price action was good on this Friday. Looks like a bullish outside day above all the key moving averages, and we'll have to see whether it can make its way above towards the 229.84 pivot and eventually towards all-time highs. These small caps have really just been basing the majority of 2021, which is why it's been so difficult for a lot of growth stock traders and investors. There hasn't been that much fall through, that much kind of push with the overall indexes as the overall kind of wind at your back going with the current. So that is the IWM. Also taking a look at the FFTY, the Innovator IBD 50 ETF. This really shows the destruction in growth land. We have a big gap down close near the lows, and then a big move on this Friday off the 200 SMA. So this is constructive, but once again, we're below a declining 21 EMA. Obviously, the trend over the past week and really the end of September is down, and we really basically want to see some fall through and even some tight action and then some fall through. That would be much more constructive, but it's not really healthy for indexes and stocks to do this kind of V-shaped recovery, and most likely there'll be a lot of ups and downs before we finally basically shoot to all-time highs once again. But once again, be open to any possibility, whether we undercut the 200 SMA and this prior low or continue on towards all-time highs. Moving on, I like to keep track of some gap ups. That gives you a great sense of how kind of hedge funds are interpreting the action and basically their risk appetite. AFRM has been holding up really well despite the poor action on these 2 days. It ended up the week with 2 inside days, basically with all this trading range within the prior day's trading range, and a good closing range as well on Thursday and Friday. So this is high up on my list to buy if it does break out above these highs right here, and it's also holding up above the 21 EMA, a clear sign of relative strength. Yeah, definitely one I'm watching going forward, and we'll have to see how it acts next week. And I believe on a weekly chart, it's also a nice inside week with a decent push off these lows. Some other stocks I'm watching pretty closely. GLBE is holding up well above the 50 SMA. Not a great candle on this day on higher volume, downside reversal, but it's holding up above the 50 SMA. And if it does break below these lows, this kind of pattern, this kind of base on base is kind of void, but so far it's holding up well, especially with respect to the general market, just kind of going sideways as the general market is correcting a little bit. And this is basically one I'm watching going forward. UPST had its first close below the 10-day simple. I don't have that plotted here, but you can see it had basically been holding this trend line for the majority of this run. And this is the first big sign of weakness. It did have a big push off the 21 EMA, but once again, this looks like a little bit of the left side of a correction, and a quick push to all-time highs would be a little bit unnatural. And we'll have to see whether it can retake the 300 level and start to build a structure above that point. But those are a few stocks I'm watching. Let me know your thoughts down below on those names. We saw a lot of leaders take a hit, and we'll get into those charts later on in TC2000. But I thought I'd just throw these out here because these are ones that kind of lead the market because they're such big leaders that either to the upside or downside, they're very, very important to watch very carefully because they kind of give a tip off on what the general market is going to do. So that is UPST and a few other select names. And now let's move on to the other leaders in TC2000. And if you do enjoy my analysis on this video, please go ahead and leave a like down below. It just takes a few seconds out of your day and helps me out immensely. It basically tells YouTube that this is good material and to basically push it to a wider audience. So I'd really appreciate it if you do that. And of course, subscribe if you don't want to miss more videos just like this one. And we've got a bunch of great interviews with US investing champion, contenders, hedge fund managers coming up. So you don't want to miss that. So definitely subscribe as well. With that said, let's dive right into potential market leadership and sort by that weekly change. And this is basically a quick hack to determine what held up really well last week, sort by that weekly change, what basically held up the best over the course of this past week, and also sorting by the weekly change. The weekly closing range is definitely something that I'm doing. You can see Bill here is showing up on both those sorts. GDRX as well showed really strong action late in the week. You can see that RS line climbing as well. So sorting by that weekly closing range and just weekly change is definitely a way to find those leaders, those stocks that were being supported by the institutions. And with that said, let's get into the charts. And just looking at this watch list, you can see there's a lot below the 21 EMA, below the 50 SMA. That's where these red dots show up. But we do have on this last day a bunch of upside reversals. So when I'm sorting and looking for relative strength, I just kind of tab through and sort by these different values. Daily closing range will show you what showed relative strength today. You can see net basically finished right at the highs. And I also have a video about how to scan for relative strength, which should help with finding basically those stocks that held up really well this past week. So I'll link that below as well. And it also should be popping up on the screen right now. But with that said, let's get back to the chart analysis and start with bill.com. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Overall, strong gap up. It's been holding this low really well, and even the open here, and had a basically strong performance ever since that Tuesday turnaround, that gap down, good closing range, and move up. Although on lighter volume, holding up much better than general market. You can see that in the relative strength line. So this looks pretty good. Domo also holding above the key moving averages. You can see it pulled back below this prior pivot and didn't fall all the way back to the 200-day, but had a pretty steep correction here, about 23%, and maybe moving up the right-hand side here. You've got a little bit of a pivot, consolidation pivot around 85. Tesla is another one that I'm watching very closely. Let me go ahead and show these drawings and go over to this one. You can see you've got a pivot right at this point. And although it didn't finish the week above it, you have nice upside reversal action on this last day. And it's holding the 10-day moving average when the general market is well below that mark. So this is definitely showing relative strength. And you also have it kind of pulling back right to this prior pivot and a strong push off that, as well as the confluence of the 10-day simple. So I'm watching for follow through next week. And going over to a weekly chart, you can see it's been really strong the past few weeks. And going over to a monthly, a nice push off this right-hand side and pretty tight action in October so far. So that is Tesla. Definitely should be high up on your radar along with AFRM in terms of stocks that are holding up really well. GDRX, also a little bit of a character change. You had a retest of this prior pivot here and a really strong move, especially on this Friday. Nice pocket pivot volume signature here, 3-bar break to the upside and retaking all the key moving averages. This looks like a little bit of a character change and potentially the start of the right-hand side within its institutional due diligence phase, its first long-term base after its IPO. DDOG also holding the 21 EMA, looks pretty good. Relative strength line and basically price in a nice uptrend since this High volume gap up and strong closing range looks great, just trending above those moving averages. LC, another one holding up really nicely. You have a little bit of a anchor VWAP pinch here going on, and it's held this level, the anchor VWAP, from the gap up on huge volume really well, going over to a 65-minute chart. You can see it's basically touched it 3 times and responded really nicely each of those times, and building a little bit of a structure here between 28 and 27.75 or so, although not a great close today at the end of the day, but definitely showing a little bit of relative strength, holding up above the 50-day simple as well. FIGs also holding up reasonably well. Not great action on this day, very volatile, emotional price action, but it has corrected already. Basically about 25%. It's back near the bottom of this prior base. Nice upside reversal action after this undercut, and we'll have to see whether it can get back and start to trend above all these moving averages. Descom trending above all the key moving averages. Nice action after this gap up on earnings, breaking out of this longer term base. And you can see it's this first touch of the 50-day area, 10-week area, and nice upside reversal action on this Tuesday as well as on this Friday. DOCN, nice action as well, undercutting reclaim of the 21 EMA. Bullish outside day looks pretty strong and is holding up really well, although you do see some high volume. You can see on this day, it actually was supported volume because it had a good closing range, and you do see some distribution back here, but in general, volume has been really light these 3 days, these 4 days here where it was pulling back, which is very constructive, especially considering the super powerful move up of about 70%. AMD also showing some support off the basically anchored VWAP area from these lows. Nice upside reversal on this day and also on this Friday, and we'll have to see whether it can build back above these short-term moving averages. It did undercut the 50 SMA, and I actually bought this on this Friday, was stopped out for a small gain, very close to the open here on this day, where it basically had a expectation breaker on very high volume, reversing with the general market. Team also holding above the 21 EMA, looks pretty good, nice trend here. Apps, you can see, is building something here off the 200 SMA, so a little bit of a character change because it had been resistance back here. It's now shifting to potentially support, and it had a 2-2 reversal on this Friday. Looks pretty good, and you can see these pullbacks these 2 days are on below average volume, especially considering basically comparing to the strong action, a bunch of pocket pivots up the right-hand side. GLBE, where I talked about holding above the key moving averages, it has to hold this base low here, and it looks a little bit vulnerable after this Friday, poor action, poor close, but we'll have to see where it goes from here, whether it holds up here or starts to pull back towards the lows of this base. Moving on to CrowdStrike, you can see it pull back pretty hard Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, but had an inside bar and up to end out the week, and overall not huge volume on these pullbacks. AMBA, another stock to have on your watch list. You can see very light volume on this pullback, and so far it's holding pretty close to the 158 area, which had been prior resistance, but I wouldn't mind a gentle retest of the 21 EMA and then some sort of structure right at that area, but pretty tight the past 4 days. NVIDIA, you can see pulling back here below the short-term moving averages, but big upside reversal on this Friday, so we'll have to see whether this falls through to the upside and retakes the 50. Skin also holding up really well, and another one that you should definitely have on your relative strength list. You can see pretty decent action here, nice tails, and very low volume during this pullback week. AFRM, where I talked about, double inside days to end out the week, looks strong. CMG, upside reversal here, looks like potentially the bottom of the base, so we'll have to see whether it can retake this kind of 1,840 level on volume, and I really like the close this week. And we'll have to see how this acts. Zscaler pulling back to the 50 SMA for the first time since this breakout. I don't like this gap down and go on high volume, but so far it is holding near this level. App, big upside reversal and bullish outside day on this Friday, looks decent, holding up within the structure. SC, upside reversal here, retaking the 50 SMA. Dash, not super strong action, although you have really low volume on this pullback, so watch for a push upwards on high volume, and maybe expect a pullback to the 50 SMA here around 195, but we'll have to see how it acts next week. SQ, double inside days to end out the week, but it's below the 200-day SMA, and this has been really choppy, difficult to trade here, really up and down, and it needs a little bit of a character change before I would be interested. Docs leaking down to the 50 SMA, but not huge volume on this basically decline here below a 10-day simple as well as below a 10-day simple as well as 21 EMA at this point. S pulling back pretty sharply here. You do see high volume distribution on this decline, and there's been signs of that since this really emotional action here. And although it basically went back to all-time highs, you can see it wasn't quite the same here, and you do see a lot of distribution coming in as it pulls back 26%. Fiverr, you can see pull back decently hard, not huge volume, but you do see some distribution on this day especially, but decent end to the week holding these ranges. Snap, you can see very volatile action, emotional price action, declining on high volume, but holding up reasonably well within the structure above 70. Roblox just kind of leaking below here right at the base lows. Once again, you definitely want to see these hold, but we'll have to see where it goes from here. You do see above average volume on these pullbacks. UPST, first break of the 10-day simple, but holding that 21 EMA. Not a super convincing close, but a decent push off the lows here, about 6% or so. And we'll have to see whether it forms out a base or just kind of rips back to all-time highs. Net, decent action, especially on Thursday and Friday. Big upside reversal on this Friday, although you do see very high volume on this pullback, and you can see maybe the start of the left-hand side of a base. Crocs, you can see also pulling back below the 50 SMA. Not huge volume on this pullback. U pulling back to the 50 SMA. Some high volume here on this drop, but it's holding that moving average at this point. And you can see the top of the prior base is around 116 or so, so I'll be watching that level. SBT acting decently into the end of the week, but you do have some distribution signs on this Monday, breaking all these lows and fall through to the downside with a gap down on very high volume, and then a rebound on lighter volume. In mode, very volatile action on this day, especially also on Friday, big upside reversal. And we'll have to see how this goes. This has had quite a run without a proper consolidation, proper base. ASAN also pulling back for the first time in quite a while, back below the 21 EMA, which had been basically a guardrail throughout this entire uptrend. And good upside reversal on this Friday, but we'll have to see where this goes from here. Once again, this could easily revisit the 50 SMA. PLTR not showing a lot of strength here, declining on 2 above average volume days, but a decent end to the week on lighter volume. DLO leaking down below the 50 SMA, filling out this gap, and some above average volume on this day on Tuesday. LSPD really tanking hard. I think there's a short report on this day as well, the highest volume ever. So we'll have to see whether it can retake this high volume close, which is now a volume anchor. Moderna, also some news, obviously, with the new treatment that's out. So we'll have to see where this goes, but definitely this violated the base low and needs a lot of time, and I'll be taking this off this list. AEHR kind of was holding up well, holding this low pretty much from the gap up, but kind of broke expectations on this Friday, so it needs a little bit more time in my book, but we'll have to see whether it just 2-2 reversals back towards all-time highs or builds out a larger structure. And lastly, we've got BNTX, which had a big upside reversal, but once again, breaking these base lows and expectations. So overall, that's a run through of leadership stocks. Some are holding up reasonably well, especially Bill, Tesla, GDRX, LC, DDOG, a lot of them at the top of this list. If you sort by that weekly change or sorting by that weekly closing range, but definitely some need a lot of time down here when they're kind of leaking below base lows and below the key moving averages. And you have to be careful if you're a trader, you don't want to stay in a stock that's acting like that. So let me know your thoughts down below. What stocks should I take off of this list? What stocks am I missing at this point? There'll be a lot of changes coming to this list in the coming weeks for sure. Moving on, let's talk about my focus list and talk about how basically that acted last week. Let's sort by that weekly change. Bill, we already talked about Tesla as well. AMD we covered as well. Crowd, MDB, holding pretty much this low. So this could be actionable above these highs, but I don't like the look of these gap downs, but you don't have a lot of volume, which is promising. And moving on to Lulu, it basically lost the low of this consolidation, definitely an expectation breaker here on Tuesday and back below the 50 SMA, and looks like it's kind of retesting the top of this prior base around 400. So definitely a place where you want it to make a stand if you're holding stock. And if you bought on the gap up, you definitely should be stopped out at this point. Hood was shaping up reasonably well last week, but looks like it's just kind of revisiting the base low. But once again, not huge volume on this decline, so that is promising, not huge signs of distribution. Etsy was holding up well, but definitely fell apart a little bit on the 28th and had a big upside reversal off the 200 SMA to end out the week. So we'll have to see where this goes. It looks like it needs a little bit of time from my end. Docs we talked about Monday, pulling back to the 50 SMA, definitely an expectation breaker on this Tuesday, and you do see high volume on these declines. Melly, you can see pulling back to an interesting spot right at this prior, basically base within a base high, the pivot, as well as the 200 SMA, and we'll have to see whether it chooses to rebound or break that point of resistance. ZI breaking expectations on Monday and Tuesday on reasonably high volume, and then have a lighthearted bounce on light volume. DLO we talked about, Moderna we talked about as well. So a lot of these need a little bit of time, and basically with the gap down, this list was kind of invalidated, and I kind of switched my perspective to just searching for relative strength. And if you'd like me to make a video on basically my routine during a correction, let me know. But definitely watch that video on how to handle pullbacks and market corrections. That should answer the majority of your questions. So now let's move on to sentiment from a few different sources and start with some Twitter surveys. So last week, the bullish reading was 57.6%. Now it's 50.5%. So we do see a decrease. This is actually reasonably high, which is kind of correlated to Friday's positive action. But right on the 30th, I put out this survey. What happens first? We rally 5% or we draw 5%. The overwhelming majority, 61.8%, very different to these numbers here. Basically said we drop 5% first. So there was a lot of fear coming to the market on these days. Looking at the NAAIM exposure index, we see a big drop, which is what I like to see, down to 55.02. That's great. There's a lot of fear coming in. The put call ratio is pretty high, staying high, which is good. And the bulls versus bears poll continues to decline. So there's a lot of fear coming in. I do see a little bit of complacency on Twitter saying we've already bottomed. In my view, that's not necessarily the case. We have to kind of take every day as new information and make decisions along the way. I'm really waiting for some confirmation, especially with a lot of setups and market leaders emerging before I really jump in and get to full exposure once again in the market. So moving on to the IBD Big Picture article, the headline is Stock Market Rallies in Light Volume, Capping Ugly Week for Growth Stocks. So they discuss the action on lighter volume, how MRK basically came out with that new oral treatment, which should do wonders. That's awesome. That's great news. But BNTX, Moderna, and a bunch of other kind of COVID vaccine-related stocks obviously suffered as a result of that news. I discussed Airbnb, which is also holding up well. They also discussed the action in FFTY and also kind of what to do now that we're in their minds, a market in correction. And they also discuss Bill, GLBE, which are standing out to me as well. And overall, their view is a market in correction. You have some leaders up in volume, leaders down in volume. So that is their take on the market. Lastly, we've got the Wishing Wealth GMI Signal, which is currently red since September 22. And the GMI score on Thursday was a 1 out of 6. And you can see that Dr. Wish highlighted some red, white, blue patterns down here, which are definitely pretty bearish in terms of Apple and Amazon. And we'll have to see how these trends emerge. So overall, my current outlook is kind of a market in pullback mode. I think we need a little bit of time for setups to properly emerge, but we did have a promising end to the week on Friday. But I can't discount the high level of distribution that we saw basically for 4 straight days. So be careful, be ready for any scenario, whether we kind of rip next week, have a basically list of relative strength stocks that are holding up really well to go to if you do decide to make some buys and pick your spots, but also be ready for us to roll over and continue on into a deeper correction. So that's my view on the market. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and leave a like down below and subscribe if you're new to the channel. And I'll see you guys in future videos. Thanks.